Good day. Today I'm making a piece of wrought iron railing. Anytime you use a piece of molded cap, it is tremendously hard to bend it in a radius shape. Over the years I've learned that I slice it into these small pieces and then bend it, and then you have to go back in and fill all those slices in with your weld. Obviously in handrails, both of your radiuses need to match, and that's sometimes a very difficult thing to do because of everything changing. Metal kind of is a natural product and has a little bit of a mind of its own. I first started welding when I was about 10 years old. My father, who I talk a lot about in my book, knew that he was going to die, and he knew that I would need to survive in the world, and so he had a very brutal way of teaching at times. And so for instance, when I was about 6 years old or so, I wanted to learn how to ride a bike. I did not have a bike my size. There was only my brother's bike, who was about 10 years older. And so after asking this, he's like, all right. So he takes my brother's bike, which was way too tall for me, and takes me out to a hill beside the house, and he puts me on the bike and pushes me down the hill. And of course I get to the bottom of the hill, and I'm crying and everything else, and he shouts, "Drag it to the top of the hill. You're the one that asked for this. You wanted to learn." And so at that point, you were committed. You had to drag it to the top of the hill or be spanked. And so drag it to the top of the hill, he sets me on it, pushes me again, and you get down the hill. Finally, what he was teaching actually in that is that I needed to be a self-educator. I needed to be self-taught, and that continued throughout my life. When I started welding, like I said, about 10 years old, my dad had this huge, what was called a Lincoln tombstone welder. And for my birthday, he had been to a surplus auction, and he bought this old surplus canister of like 2,000 welding rods, like this long, big aluminum canister. And that was my birthday present. Here you go. And he took me over to a scrap metal pile that he had at his shop, and he goes, "Ben, you can use every single one of these. You can use every single piece of this metal. Just learn your trade well." Can you imagine telling a 10-year-old boy, learn your trade well? And I did. We didn't have a TV in our house. We didn't have other activities. Life was really serious. And my father having AIDS and going all through that. The only other activity we did was go to church. So I started welding, and I enjoyed it. I started making little pieces of art. Actually, I've got one that I made when I was just a kid sitting on my front porch now. And I enjoyed it, and I started using all of those welding rods and things. But then what I soon realized is that when my dad would go back to the National Institutes of Health, that all of a sudden people started dropping off things at our house to be welded. My dad sold tractor trailers and heavy equipment. And there was around the Wheat Hill house, which I talk a lot about in the book of Say, there were all these peach farms. So you had all these farmers who had farm tractors and combine tires and all this. And since tractor tires have a mix of antifreeze and water in them, the wheels often rusted. And rather than going and buying a wheel, you would look for a proficient welder to weld that hole up, grind it down, repaint it. So basically you had a new wheel again. And when my dad would be in the hospital and we didn't have any income or money or anything, all of a sudden these farmers would drop off their wheels. And how we got started doing that was, I was out in my dad's shop one day. This farmer comes by with one of these wheels. My dad's name was Jerry. He said, "Jerry, do you think you can weld this up for me?" The hole was about that big around. And I was a kid, I was out there, you know, always. And so my dad says, well, Ben, why don't you see if you can do this? You know, it's just a piece of trash. It's not going to be any good anyways. Why don't you practice, Ben? And so I did. And I welded up the hole in this farmer's tire. And guess what? The next week, here was 2 or 3 more. And, you know, so I would weld these holes up, and I just assumed it was just a game for me. It was fun, but evidently somebody was collecting however much it was for Jerry's son, you know, this 10, 11-year-old kid, to weld up these tractor tires because they kept coming. And then the jobs kept changing as these farmers wanted to change an old truck into a dump bed or extend the frame, extend the drive shaft. I started doing those things. Not the drive shaft. Drive shaft had to be taken to a machine shop, which is a completely other story I'll talk about some other time. But I learned how to weld. And then as, you know, my career changed and progressed and I became a sculptor of stone, I started traveling the world. I didn't weld as much. Occasionally I would, you know, when there was a need for it and nobody was around to do it. And so then when I moved to Charlottesville after my wife and daughter died, and I had to kind of start over and redo things, you know, I put in the ad in the paper one winter that I would make handrails. And how that got started is I was doing a project for a customer and they wanted a handrail made, and I was like, well, that's pretty easy, I could do that. And that morning I had seen an old set of handrails for sale, like on Craigslist or something, and it clicked. I said, okay, well, I can take that old set of handrails, refurbish it, change it, and install it in this house. And sure enough, I did, and it turned out great. And then I started having more and more ironwork. It was nice because I went to Harbor Freight. I bought a little $100 welder, and all of a sudden I could make a living just doing this welding work in the winter, and it served me really well. But talking about my dad, the reason I weld now for enjoyment is because it kind of connects me to him. Even though he was a brutal teacher, and at some of these points, my dad, the sickness of AIDS softened my dad up a lot, and my dad became my best friend. And I tried to explain a little bit of that in the book. I felt like I could have, if my editor would have let me, I would have talked a lot more about my close relationship with my father. It became incredibly sweet and nice. My father had a beautiful voice. Like I said before, we didn't have a TV in our house, so after dinner, my father would sit down and we would talk. We'd have these beautiful conversations, and rarely was it ever about God or his religious beliefs or that. It was about airplanes. It was about how they fly and about how air flows over the wing, and how that is a symbol. Every time he saw an airplane, it was a symbol of man and nature working together and creating this beautiful thing of flight. Giving yourself a new point of view by elevating yourself above the circumstances that surround you. And he taught me about balance. I remember so many lessons. He would take a pencil and he would balance that pencil across his finger, and he would say, everything, Ben, has a center of balance. It may take you some time. Give yourself a little bit of time and liberty, but when you find that center of balance, things will be easy. Things will prosper for you. And, you know, if you overload yourself one way, you're going to fall. If you don't give yourself enough, you're going to fall. But find that center of balance. And hey, it's okay to fail. Just go back and try to find it again, and eventually you will. And the more that you find it, the more you will find it. And so these very beautiful things about my father that I hope I portrayed some in the book, and I hope that comes through. And if not, that's the purpose of these videos, is even though my father was misguided in his religious traditions, belief, there was a great beauty within him, something that I really appreciate. And welding, working with my hands, is something that still allows me to connect with my father, even though he's been gone now almost 24 years. So I wish you the best. I'm going to keep working and weld these things together. Give yourself a lot of love today. Be good to yourself, and be honest with yourself. That way you can be honest with others. Remember the essential things: faith, hope, and love. They're the sacred ornaments to our lives.